It being 6 o'clock, I will call this January 31st, 2022 meeting of the Chelmsford Select Board to order. Would you please join me in the pledge? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, first up, we have public service announcements. Paul, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I want to provide the community with notice, 4 weeks from tonight, on the 28th of February, in this room, which will also be remote access, that we'll be doing a presentation and receiving public input regarding a roadway and sidewalk construction plan for the upcoming year, and obviously a multiple year period as well. So we wanted to provide notice to the community of their interest, and also any thoughts and concerns. We welcome them at that time, and obviously thereafter. So
Thank you. And I should have noted for the record, Board Member Dixon is absent this evening, and the town's finance director, John Souza, has joined us for the budget discussion, agenda item number 5. Next, we have public input, and I don't see any members of the public in this room or on Zoom, so we'll go on to committee vacancies. Ken?
Committee vacancies as of January 31st, 2022. The Arts and Technology Education Fund is looking to fill 1 3-year term. Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Committee, 1 unexpired 3-year term and 1 3-year term. The CC Advisory Committee has 2 seats available. They're 1-year terms. Center Village Master Plan Implementation Committee has 1 1-year term. Commissions on Disability has 1 unexpired 3-year term. Community Action Program Committee has 3 1-year terms available. Council on Aging is looking to fill 1 unexpired 3-year term, 1 3-year term, and 5 associate member positions. Cultural Council has 2 3-year terms. Holiday Decorating Committee has 2 1-year terms. Parade Committee, all applicants are welcome. Those are 1-year terms ending July 31st each year. Public Celebration Committee has 5 1-year terms. Recycling Committee has 1 1-year term. Tree Committee has 1 unexpired 3-year term and 1 3-year term.
Skipped over the parade committee.
Which one?
Parade.
No, I said all
No,
applicants are
she
welcome.
said it.
You said holiday decorating.
All right, jump right. No,
I don't know, I think
I said parade. All applicants are welcome to 1-year terms ending July 31st, 2022. I said that.
Would you like an instant playback?
we don't have time.
If you're interested in serving on a town board or committee, please contact the town manager's office here at 50 Billerica Road, or you can send an email, tmoffice@chelmsfordma.gov, or call 978-250-5202, or you can go online and look at the online application and find out more information. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Next, we have the town manager's proposed fiscal '23 budgets.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board. In accordance with the town charter, the town manager is to release a budget 90 days prior to the commencement of the spring session of town meeting, which at this point is scheduled for April 25th. I've presented the budget in your packets last Thursday, the 27th of January. To meet that obligation, I've also sent it to the Finance Committee, Superintendent of Schools, and department heads and so forth. And I'm pleased to have John Souza, our Finance Director, with me this evening to go over the highlights of the budget and discuss how we see things at this point in time. I'm not going to go through every slide of the 67 or whatever pages there are. I just want to sort of provide highlights to provide the board and the community an understanding of what's in the proposed budget that'll be considered at April town meeting. And in speaking to Jim Clancy, the Finance Director, Finance Committee Chair, the Finance Committee is expected to begin their sessions in terms of review of the budget and to hear the presentation and then follow up beginning on February 10th, Thursday evening. So that's when they'll start their process. And that process regularly runs on Thursday evenings virtually with remote sessions, probably through mid-March at this point in time. So that's sort of where we are. So to come to the budget, at slide 3, this sort of gives an overview of the budget. When all is said and completed, the budget will be roughly $149.5 million, or 3.5% above the current year appropriation level. Of that, the largest use of those funds are for the Chelmsford Public Schools, which is roughly proposing appropriation of $67.5 million, which is an increase of $2.5 million or 3.85% over the current level. The general government departments of the town would be $33.5 million, an increase of $1.5 million or 4.5%. So you can see there, you're roughly at $101 million. Nashoba Tech, we have not received their proposed budget yet. That's going to come out in the next couple of weeks. But at this point, based on looking at the traditional growth of the district's budget as well as our impact on our enrollment, which affects our contribution, I'm estimating an increase of $100,000 roughly, or 2.8%. The other big component of our town budget is benefits and insurance. That would amount to $28.5 million, or $1.6 million, or 5.8% increase. And on our debt service, that's $11.3 million, which is down $1.4 million from the current fiscal year, or down 11%. So that's a high-level aspect of the budget. If you go to page 6, you'll see, the budget priorities remain the same. The budget line item changes are there enumerated by category, because at town meeting we vote by category, by expenditure and personnel services. But roughly it just gives you the overview of where I see the $4.5 million of funding increasing. And you can see obviously the decline in debt service that I spoke of earlier. And obviously the big items are the schools and benefits and insurance.
What's the boldface mean?
Oh, the boldface, I just highlight you just to point out large numbers or significant increases. Accompanying this document, you have the detailed 75-page line item budgets that go through each one of these areas of category that explain, what is it that drives these numbers underneath. Now, again, the other thing to note is this doesn't include the funding for new collective bargaining agreements, because under our town bylaws, we do not pre-fund collective bargaining agreements on the general government side. The school department does not bring its agreements to town meetings, so their budget has a funding available for them to settle their agreements. And then on the general government side, when an agreement is reached, it then goes to town meeting for ratification and funding at that point in time. So when you see a disparity between the revenue number and the expenditure number of what we see growing, there is a holdback, because we know that those funds will come in a future date. So that's why when you say, well, why are your revenues different than your expenditures? Yeah, please, go ahead.
If the budget's increasing at 3.46%, and then you go to the slide, page 6, all those expenses except for Nashoba Tech and the library are way above 3.46. So how does the budget grow at 3.46, but the individual lines are more than that?
Well, because again, percentages on small numbers distort. When you have big numbers like 1.4 million less in debt service, that has a big impact on the overall, which is an 11% decline. When you have smaller numbers like a 14.9% in community services, that number gives a large increase. So that's sort of how it plays out in the analysis. I mean, the big one obviously is the schools. The schools are the biggest category of the budget. When you look at the school budget appropriation of $67.5 million, that's more than a third of the town's budget. That's less than 4%, and so that's why you have.
The percentages still hold. I mean, if you only have 3.46% more to spend, but everybody else's these items are more than 3.46, doesn't it work out to more money than?
No, not when your two largest categories are, your large categories are less than that. Anyway, we can go through it and we can reference it on the spreadsheet.
Because kind of what I'm wondering is the debt service going down offsetting the need for more money?
Well, yes, yeah. I mean, that's non-excluded debt service goes down, not excluded debt service, because excluded debt service doesn't provide funding for the budget. So that's sort of how it plays out.
So we're getting help from our.
We're getting help from the declining debt service. Yeah, that's happened over time. And if you take those numbers and look over time, if you get down 2 slides to the 5-year expenditure comparison, I like to do this and look over time. Well, what's happening? Where are the funds going? And the bold numbers are just meant to draw our attention to what, again, larger numbers. over a 5-year period, the schools go up over 10 million, roughly $2 million per year. And then benefits and insurance, another big driver, 5.64 million, or 25% over a 5-year period. So that's the big driver in it. And those numbers really draw it. And then if you look at your debt service over a 5-year period, it's gone down over 20%, or $3 million. So to go to the point you just made, Selectman LaFave, it's clearly the debt service is allowing, other areas of the budget to grow. And that day will come that when you do issue debt, like, for example, we know the school committee tomorrow night will be discussing a school project with Dora Whittier and so forth. Any project of that magnitude is going to be excluded debt, so it won't impact the operating budget. And as we get into this, you'll see the difference between the excluded debt and non-excluded debt. We can't offset the excluded debt under Proposition 2.5 with regular expenditures. The excluded debt is only tied to that, so it only exists and allowed to be raised by the state government for that project, and then when it's not needed for that project, it goes away. But our debt service in general is declining slightly as well over time. And you can see over a 10-year period on the next slide, you see the same trends continuing. Over 10 years, you've had a $20 million increase in school funding. Benefits insurance have gone up over $1 million per year over 10 years. Your debt service has gone down less over a 10-year period, $1.9 million. So you're seeing this rise and fall of debt service. So that just gives you a sense of magnitude of what's happening. If you now move on to slide 11, the school budget, as we saw, $67.5 million, as I mentioned at the outset. The big change this year is the $2.5 million for this year is more in line with what it had been in previous years. And you can see we had the anomaly between 21 and 22, but if you sort of average it out, the school budget was going up around $2 million or so, $2.5 million back to 18. So you can see the funding increase is roughly percentage-wise where it has traditionally been in 18, 19, 20, and roughly where it had been in 21, 22. And as we'll see a little later, that's all driven by labor costs, because it's an educational institution by and large. The big change that we see on the next slide, on slide 12, is Chapter 70 funding. Last Wednesday, Governor Baker released his proposed state budget, his final state budget, and at 4:30 that afternoon, they released the local aid numbers based on the governor's proposed budget. And those are the best figures that we have at this point in time, and it will be until we go to town meeting, because the House Representatives won't pick up and vote their budget till the end of April, and then the Senate won't vote its budget till the end of May, and then it'll go to conference committee with a hope to get a budget in place by July 1st out of the fiscal year. But they generally don't get it done. They do a 1/12 budget and then finish the state budget the end of July before they recess for the session, and then head off to the fall elections. Why that cherry sheet is so important, even though it's only the first indicator, is it gives us insight into the local aid accounts, i.e. Chapter 70 aid, general government assistance, our assessments for charter schools, our reimbursements for benefits and so forth for veterans and so forth. This number caught all of us off guard. I mean, you can see the anomaly. It's $614,000 in additional Chapter 70 education funding, or 5.41%. We were anticipating the roughly $150,000 level that we've received for the last 4 or 5 years. What we think is happening here is we went through all the state's website, Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, and see how that number gets calculated and the corresponding increase in net school spending. We think it may be a result of the implementation of the state funding formula that now tracks benefits such as health insurance costs for school employees and so forth, which were new to the education formula. So we think this may be a one-time adjustment. We won't know better until next year. The challenge is going to be next year, just even though it's out in the future, is there'll be a new governor next year. And when a new governor takes office, a new administration, they give the new governor 5 weeks after inauguration to submit a budget, which means we won't see next year's proposed governor's budget and state aid numbers till probably mid-February. But anyway, that's from there. But the number that we did receive was larger than we thought and anticipated.
Were other
And-
towns in the same situation?
No.
It was
No.
Chelmsford, okay.
Yeah, it wasn't just Chelmsford, but we were, most communities were minimum aid communities, and we were expecting the $30 per student, and we have roughly 5,000 students, so they say, well, is the $30 a student times 5,000 students, and you can see that number is much larger. We're going to continue efforts to reach out to state officials to better understand that number. We don't believe it's an error because they painstakingly go through the process, and you can see the breakdown on how they do the calculations. But anyway, that number is now based into this budget. What we've seen historically is the local aid Chapter 70 number will not decrease when it goes to the House or the Senate. In the 8 years that this governor's been in office, and even his predecessors, we've never seen a situation where the legislature would underfund what the governor has done. And the reason for that is they know communities generally use the governor's numbers as the base mark for town meetings. The other thing that occasionally happens and did not happen this year and was not discussed this year is oftentimes there's a local aid resolution that the House and Senate will do to provide communities with a local aid number. That did not occur this year, and usually that would be done by March. There's no mention of it, and I think what's happening is the municipal associations instead is going to lobby the House and the Senate for additional funding, and in fact, you may have seen one of their issuances already where they're explaining concerns on two factors. One is the Chapter 70 funding, where there's 140 communities that are getting just $30 per student minimum. The other is the fact of the unrestricted general government aid, which we always knew as lottery aid and additional assistance. The governor only increased that by 2.9%, which was technically true that he increased it with the level of the growth in the state budget, but it kind of omitted the fact of the massive growth of the state budget between last year's estimate and this year's estimate going forward, which really underfunded the partnership with local communities, and you may have seen those messages coming out as well. So anyway, that's where we are on Chapter 70 funding. We're roughly now would receive roughly $12 million. If you go to the next slide, I included the net school spending requirement, and you can see the dramatic jump. Traditionally, it had been about $1 million a year. From 21, you see that. From 21 to 22, we were at $55 million in required net school spending by the state, and then it was 56.2. And you can see this year it jumped by $3 million. So we think, again, that's sort of a tie and a connect in terms of why the extra Chapter 70 funding. Again, it's not going to create a problem for the town of Chelmsford because our net school spending is roughly $70 million. So we're well over. You can see it's $77 million in budgeted for this year, and we'll probably be closer to $80 million by the time you get to the end of the upcoming year. So it's not going to have an impact on the budget and the community. Again, providing some additional background relevance information. On the next slide, we saw this back in December. We did the budget conference. We just want to point out that the per pupil expenditure in the Chelmsford Public Schools for the current fiscal year exceeds $16,000 to the best of our information. If you then move on to slide 17, it's just a graphic slide that shows how Chelmsford is compared to comparable communities that are established by the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. I know it's probably hard to read at home, but basically Chelmsford is right in that midpoint of the communities that are listed. We fall right in the middle, and it sort of gives a sense of where we are in per pupil expenditure. The next item on page 18, again, is a nice data point, the enrollment issue. You've seen that the district has had declining enrollment for the past decade. And then you sort of saw the change in 20. That was when they went to full-day kindergarten, and the enrollment numbers changed. And then you lost COVID to 21. And the reason I mention this is we didn't get the full bounce back that we would have anticipated in the current year. And these numbers are as of October 1st, when the state does the local school census. So you can see there's still a pattern of declining enrollment in the Chelmsford Public Schools. And you can see that we're if you take out the pandemic year of 21, which obviously a lot of people removed their children from the schools and did homeschooling and so forth, you can see that, we're roughly now at, at the lowest point we've been in a decade. And so that's obviously, result of that is improved the student-teacher ratio, because you've got fewer students and the same, if not slight increases in faculty. And then towards that student-teacher ratio, that's the next slide, on slide 20. It just shows the comparable, the graphic one I think is often more helpful for folks. You want the next slide, Virginia? Yeah, you can see Chelmsford in the middle of the chart there. You've got 6 communities identified by the state as above Chelmsford, and then you've got, again, a half dozen communities below, and then I put in the neighboring communities, which aren't, just for comparative purposes. So Drake isn't seen as, in the states, as a peer community, but we include Drake, Tewksbury, Westford, and Billerica always. Just sometimes they're included in the list of comparable communities, but sometimes they're not. But we just do it for comparative in terms of our geographic area. Moving on to slide 23, you see the same report in terms of average class size. The number for Chelmsford is 17.7. You can see Chelmsford skews towards the lower end of that scale compared to our peer and neighboring communities. Now, stopping at slide 24, coming back to the issue of, well, what's driving the budget? Tomorrow evening, Dr. Lang is going to give an overview of his proposed budget, and then on March 1st, the school committee will be doing a public hearing where they'll go through the budget page by page, as they have in recent years. These are the drivers that we're seeing in terms of what's pushing the school budget to need more money than what they have the current year. And as I noted earlier in my presentation tonight, it's driven by labor costs. You've got the cost of living allowance and the step increases at $1.5 million. You've got employee lane changes, which is basically an employee who gets another degree. They compensate, in the area of teachers, you've got bachelor's, but so many credits, then master's credits, doctorate, and so forth. So you have changes of their employees because teachers are required to do continuing education in their profession. And then you also have our employee retirement incentives in terms of the payments that go out as people are leaving the system. And then you've got the forecasted increase, not surprising in this climate, of transportation costs for both special education and regular education. Those contracts are out to bid right now, so those are rough estimates. They are forecasting an increase in out-of-district special education tuition costs. They are also up for a new contracted cleaning, and then they have foresee higher costs for utilities. So roughly $2.2 million of that 2.5 that I've budgeted them are sort of targeted towards these budget drivers on the school side. Moving on to Nashoba Tech, at the next slide, as I mentioned in the outset, it's a roughly $100,000 increase on slide 26. The next slide, you see the driver of that, and as I mentioned earlier, our enrollment at Nashoba Tech as of the October 1st census decreased by 5 students, while the district's enrollment increased by 20. So our percentage share of the district's costs decreases by over 1.5% from 31.78 to 30.13. So when I look at their typical budget growth of around 3.5%, and factoring in the change in enrollment, I'm estimating an increase of roughly $100,000. I have not received any advance tip-off or information from the district superintendent or committee members, but I think history shows me that's about where we're at, because if you go to slide 28, you'll see our cost per student and our enrollment numbers. Our cost per student is roughly, I believe, over $22,000 per year. And the next slide shows what, again, similar budget drivers, as we've heard from the superintendent, of what's going to increase their budget. Again, contractual increases for their staff. Same lane changes that I mentioned earlier. Since they're a fully funded entity, they have to fund their retirement system assessment from Middlesex, much like we do, and on the general government side. And again, they're foreseeing increases in special education and health costs. They have forecasted increases in their transportation costs, health insurance, and other contractual costs. So again, that will drive their budget up, which will drive our assessment up. Moving away from the schools into the general town, I'm not going to go through each of the police and fire slides, but if you go over to slide 34, we start going through sort of the cost drivers on the town side. The biggest one is employee pay schedules. If the contracts were all settled and done, it totals out to about $1.1 million. That's not in the budget. The non-union ones are at 2%, are in the budget. But again, I'm trying to give a holistic approach to when everything is said and done at some future date, it'll be around $1.1 million. The next big one is, on the next slide, is employee and.
So
Go ahead, sure.
how much of that 1.1 is not in the budget?
We have $700,000 not in the budget right now.
Thank you. Which slide did you want to go to?
If you go to the next slide, on slide 35, employee and retiree health insurance. We've been informed that the average increase in premiums for our health insurance consortium is 3.7%. The range is from 0 to 7.5. We expect in the next 2 weeks to get our actual assessment. We've tended to be above the average, and the reason for that is we're a larger community, and larger communities' demographics tend to be older than younger communities, which then tends to mean your cost experience is higher. So based upon what we know and in terms of the enrollments and trends, we're increasing a budget increase of roughly $840,000. And speaking of the enrollment trends, on page 36 are the subscribers, and John handles this. I'm just going to ask John to just sort of give you an overview of, and give the community an overview of what's gone on with health insurance over the years in terms of active employees, retirees, and totals.
Yeah, so, thank you. Looking back this historical slide, you can see that we really haven't had significant change over this many years in the number of active employees, but the growth has really been in the retiree area. And part of that is just you're seeing people just in all parts of society have longer lifespans now. And so you're just not seeing as new folks are retiring each year, you're not seeing, you're not seeing the attrition that you normally would. So you have a larger pool of retirees that's growing over time. So it's just something we have to be mindful of. We are fortunate that the town did move to, for anyone 65 years and up towards Medicare, and so the community is only responsible for providing the Medicare supplement plan, which is a lower cost than what you would provide to an active employee.
And it's sort of, the next slide sort of shows what that means on a active employee scale, that the current year, the total premium for a family HMO plan is $26,500. The town funds 75% of that, or almost $20,000. So again, you add 5% to that, let's say 5 is a rough number, you're almost $21,000 for a family HMO plan that the town contributes. And obviously the employee contributes over $5,000. So it just gives a sense of what that is. The next big one on slide 38 is Middlesex County Retirement. The assessment is known at this point because they do a 2-year funding schedule, and this is the second year of the last valuation. It's just over $10.5 million, or an increase of $655,000, or 6.63%. And then on the next slide, on 39, it shows the history of that, and I'm going to ask John to speak to this. John's our rep to Middlesex County Retirement System, and just highlight what's driving over the years.
Sure, thank you. If you look at the first thing, that first column there is the normal cost, which would be that's the cost to provide pensions to everyone that's currently retired. And then you can see that the big thing that's driving this, the increase in the assessment, is our payment on the unfunded liability, which is in that middle column there. You can see how that's grown over time. This slide shows, about around from 2012 to the present, but if you look in that unfunded liability column, it's just been unbelievable growth, and part of that is the retirement system is, as costs go up, they're trying to fund, you basically have three ways to fund a pension system, and that's, you have employee contributions, employer contributions, and then investment gains. And, last year was certainly just a blowout year in the investment world, but, Middlesex, like many pension systems, uses a smoothing formula so that you don't get volatility in the assessment. So the good thing is that for this year's budget, we have a known number. Middlesex will be doing a whole actuarial update in the year ahead, and then they'll use those numbers to determine our fiscal year 24 and 25 assessments. But those are really, but you can see the unfunded liability is the real reason for the growth in this number.
And we're mandated by law to fund this, and their current funding schedule has the unfunded liability paid off in 15 years, 2037. Right now, they're about 51% funded, right? So it's going to be an interesting 15 years. The next item, again, just other increases, snow and ice. We've talked at this table about, and even we had our meeting back in December with the Finance Committee and School Committee. Snow removal costs are extraordinary this year. The price of road salt increased by 31%. We're now paying over $60 a ton for road salt. And then the issue of contractors, we're still down contractors, as are our neighboring communities and so forth, even with the increased level of compensation, but that does impact the budget. So I've budgeted an extra $150,000 for snow and ice removal. And again, it's a volatile situation where we don't know the weather, but I just think it's prudent given the realities of our fixed costs. So as I noted there, if we use the same salt this winter as we did last winter, which was not an extraordinary winter, it'd be an additional $100,000. And then for the incentives, I'm factoring in $50,000 for the contractual costs. The other thing to note is solid waste and recycling. Again, those are contractual costs that are known. We're entering the second and 3 years under those contracts. The collection costs are going up by over 4%, or $84,000 for solid waste and recycling. And then for the tipping of the disposal costs at the trash to energy plant, that's going up over $3 a ton, from $90 to $93.60 per ton. And when you have 17,000 tons, again, that's an increase of 41,000. So we'll be paying over $1.58 million for disposal at the trash to energy facility in Haverhill. So I've increased solid waste and recycling by both those numbers, which is 125,000. Elections, as we note, fiscal year 23 is a state election year, so we have to fund the state primary election in September, the general election in November, and then the town election next April of 23. This is an additional $53,000 beyond the current year, which is a one election year cycle, which this current fiscal year we only have the town election. So this number bobs up and down every other year. And then of the second bob up, when you have the presidential year, which happens every 4 years, it goes up even further because you're also running a primary election, usually in March in Massachusetts. So that's the election cost increase compared to the current year. And then moving on is the property and casualty. We all know, particularly in the property market, the replacement cost for buildings and the ability to get reinsurance and such has gone through the roof. And as well as the liabilities and issues on public officials, police, and so forth. So I have a 5% increase of $50,000 built into that budget. And then Medicare tax on slide 44 is basically your payroll tax. As your payroll increases, the amount of tax that we pay increases. So it's roughly $49,000. So we'll be paying $1.125 million townwide for Medicare payroll tax. Now moving on to the debt service. Again, our debt service is low. This I took from our Standard & Poor's rating report. it's less than 3% of market value, but the most important thing to note is we have rapid amortization of our debt schedule, with 94% of it scheduled to be paid in 10 years. Basically, what's going to happen in the next 10 years is you'll have the end of the sewer debt being paid off that was funded by the property tax levy, which is excluded debt. If you now move on to excluded debt in the next slide, you'll see that the excluded debt is expected to fall from 3.19 million to 2.08 million. This is a decrease, obviously, of 1.1 million, or almost 35%. However, as I noted at the bottom of the page, and as I mentioned earlier, this doesn't provide any relief to the operating budget. The excluded debt is calculated separately and tracked by the Department of Revenue, and obviously tracked locally too. And every year that number is analyzed, and it's addition to our base levy under Proposition 2.5. So again, that number is going down now to, you can see by over a third, to just over $2 million. And as I said, once the final years of the sewer project that were funded earlier with excluded debt go away, it'll go away completely unless there's new debt. The more notable one is the non-excluded debt, which is the next slide. And you can see here, there's a savings of $275,000 roughly in non-excluded debt. So that is something that we do pick up in the budget. You can see our debt had been roughly 7.5 million. You start looking back over the past few years, we're now below 7 million, which is sort of a levelized. We don't anticipate it going much further down in the future. Where you saw the decreases when we pay off the things like the police station project or the library, that's why you see these drops in years like, well, gee, why did it drop so much from 21 to 22 and 22 to 23? If you go back, we're no longer paying debt service on the library project or the police station project. So that's how that frees up capacity within the budget. And good news is there really isn't anything major foreseen in those type of projects in the near future. So again, on slide 50, just sort of summarizes those numbers that I mentioned in terms of the budget drivers. An aggregate level, and then moving on to 51 just shows the allowable increase in the funding the budget. You got the 2.5% allowed increase. You've got the projected new growth of 1.5 million, which is roughly where we were this past year. And then you had the excess levy capacity, which is basically what we're allowed to assess under Proposition 2.5, which we didn't. $1 million of that was $1 million of free cash that you see at the bottom of that slide. We were also an additional roughly $500,000 below levy capacity. At the end of the year, we'll be somewhat below levy capacity because numbers aren't perfect. The new growth won't be precisely $1.5 million. And the state aid may differ, because even though the number we have now, as I mentioned earlier, is going to change. So that's how you end up with excess levy capacity in this case. If you go to the next slide, over 5 years, trying to do that same type of analysis, why I put this on here is it just gives some insight. I mean, clearly looking back over 5 years, as a percentage of the budget, the property tax continues to grow. It's roughly now would be about 78% of the budget, as opposed to 5 years ago it was 76% of the budget. And the other thing is more at the bottom of the page on the Chapter 70 education funding. Over a 5-year period, you had less than 2% non-compounded growth in Chapter 70 education aid, which we noted earlier, our education budgets are increasing much more than 2%, almost double that. And then similarly, the general government aid has been treated better by Governor Baker over the years in the legislature. But again, even at 5%, 5 years at 13% is not great. And then if you go to the next slide and show it over a 10-year period, it even makes it a little more disheartening. You see the growth in the property tax from 75% of the budget to 78% of the budget, and the diminishment of state aid from 14% to 12.5%. Again, the Chapter 70 funding over a 10-year period is only 18% non-compounded, which just shows you it's been underfunded. And then general government aid has been fared better, but yet it's doesn't have, it's roughly half the amount of the Chapter 70 funding. So again, that sort of explains the continued reliance on the property tax. If you then move on to slide 55, again, the average bill for this year is $7,800. I sort of break that out by the budget percentiles. You can see roughly 45% goes to what we call the Chelmsford Public Schools budget, but if you factor in issues such as benefits and insurance, debt service and so forth, clearly the schools use more than half the town's budget. And you can see the next largest category is benefits and insurance, where roughly almost 20% of the town's budget goes to paying the retirement assessment as well as public employee health insurance for active and retired employees. The other thing to note on slide 56, as we did back in the December meeting, even within the property tax, you're having a shift of valuation. So I don't have the numbers today, but we know that the sales are based upon calendar year 2021. And clearly, we know the residential values appreciated significantly more than commercial values. So this trend is going to continue with, which then shifts again that impact to the property tax to residential. Next slide is 57. We've seen this. This shows the average single-family property tax bill. I did calculate the state ranking based on the data that's on the website, because by now, every community has issued its tax bills, and the state's still compiling its data, but on the data they've compiled, we now rank as 67th, which is where we've historically been the last 5-10 years or so, if you look at the chart. In terms of one being the highest average single-family bill, and Chelmsford, being 67th from the top. That hasn't changed, and it just shows you the taxes are going up in Chelmsford, but they're going up everywhere. And what this chart doesn't state, and if you do look at the data source for this in terms of the state rankings, there are a couple dozen communities that are excluded from this calculation because they have special legislation regarding property tax in their communities. So there are communities that have higher tax bills in Chelmsford that aren't in this because they've done local rule options such as Concord and so forth. So if you really would have put them into the data set, we're probably around 75 or so from the state. But anyway, but relying on known data and using that data, you can see relatively we're 67th, and the number of communities that enact special changes over the time, such as Sudbury and so forth, have increased slightly in the last couple of years. So we're showing that in 5 years, the increase has been $917 or 13.27%, and that if you took 2.5% compounded over 5 years, that's roughly the same number. So roughly, the average single-family bill has gone up by 2.5% over the last 5 years. And then the chart that I also presented back in December, the next slide, shows you that compared to our neighboring communities, although our tax increase was significant this year, if you look at the last 2 years, it roughly approximates what's going on out there amongst our neighboring communities. If you now move on to state aid, again, $978,000, as I noted earlier. Local receipts on the next slide is we're increasing by $430,000. We've not seen the biggest driver of that. Half of that number is motor vehicle excise. We've not seen the actual bills, but John has had a aggregate amount presented to him from the data from the registry, and those numbers appear solid. So again, we're budgeting for a period that's going to begin 6 months from now and goes from 18 months, or five months from now and goes 17 months from now, basically meaning this July 1st through June 30th of 2023. That's a ways out there, but we think these numbers are solid at this point in time, although it's going to be an interesting ride as we continue to come out of hopefully the pandemic, as well as see the impact of monetary policy by the Fed and so forth. Not much to note under available funds, which is the next slide. Those are just offsets for the revolving funds, and enterprise funds. And then the other thing I'll note on the next slide is just inflation. 5.3%, through November, because they only publish the Boston Consumer Price Index every other month. Although you've seen the data that nationwide, it was 7% for the calendar year 2021. That's going to have an impact, and you're already seeing it when the schools talk about their transportation budgets, their contractual, whether it's custodial cleaning and so forth, and we're going to see it on the town side, and it's going to have an impact going forward. We're seeing it, as I mentioned earlier, when we're dealing with snow and ice for salt purchases, fuel to operate vehicles and so forth, and like contractual plowers and so forth. And then again, the end notes at the end are I'm mindful of the issue on the property tax. Again, Chapter 70 funding, as I mentioned earlier, aren't keeping pace with inflation. And then the other disappointing news that was announced in the last 2 weeks was when the governor proposed his Chapter 90 roadway construction funding. He maintained at the same level that's been in place for the last decade of $200 million statewide. And that's only about a third of the amount that we need to maintain our roadway infrastructure. We're told that additional funding may come from the infrastructure bill that's coming out of the Congress and ARPA monies. I know the governor was down in Washington today and over the weekend, with other governors trying to get increased flexibility for roadway infrastructure. We know the president was out in Pennsylvania last week talking about he's going to fix all the bridges and so forth. The key is infrastructure is key. And we're doing our part, as we know, trying to put money into our roadways. And again, we'll have that session a month from now. And then the other thing, which is on nobody's radar, is not going to happen before the end of the legislative session. On the next slide is the whole issue of Opeb reform. This governor did nothing with it in 8 years. Governor Patrick tried to do something and it failed in his administration. And this just becomes this issue of how do we get out from underneath the increased cost for health care benefits, that if one works for a community for 10 years, they have eligibility for retiree benefits for the remainder of their lifetime. And I can tell you in all certainty that matters. We had an employee give notice last week saying, I've met my 10-year threshold, here's my 2 weeks' notice. And I know that's not unique to us, it's not unique to Chelmsford, it's just the value of that benefit is tremendous. So one could work for 20 hours a week for 10 years, and you could get the town contributing towards your retiree health care benefit for your retirement period, which in some instances can begin in your late 50s. I'll then pause there and turn it over to John to talk about the capital budget and just go over the summary on the capital. Go ahead, John.
Thank you, Town Manager Cohen. Good evening. Madam Chair, members of the board, I'd like to provide you with a brief summary of the recommended capital plan for FY23. This first slide here shows the areas, all of the capital projects that are recommended broken out by functional area. You can see that the most significant investments here in the areas of school buildings, public works, and then public safety. And the total recommended capital plan is just over $3.77 million. If we go to the next slide, we'll look at these areas a little more in depth. So under Municipal Technology, we have 2 projects recommended this year. The first is a replacement of all the switches that run our network for all municipal departments, and the cost for that is $130,000. The switches we have are nearing end of life. And the next project is a continuation. You've seen this in prior years. It was a door security upgrade, so we'll be working to transition some more buildings to the electronic security system that we have in this building and some others. And the cost for that is $100,000. Going on to the next slide, This involves, under municipal administration, the town clerk's office. You've seen in prior years, this effort's being led by our town clerk, Tricia Zuris, to update and improve a number of the vault and storage areas in this building. You can see this project will provide to digitize the planning and zoning files, which, are very, take up a significant amount of space. So that will be a big asset for the planning board and building department when that's done, as well as add some shelving in some other areas. And the cost for that is $53,000. Moving on to the next slide, this involves some masonry work at both Adams and McKay libraries. And what library administration did is bundled a number of projects together that involve the work of a mason, so that you wouldn't have to have that tradesperson, come back on when they were at different times. They're able to get a better price. So the cost for these repairs is $60,000. That picture that you see there is a picture of the chimney at Adams Library. Moving on to the next slide, these are two projects that are sorely needed for the fire department. The first is the replacement of an SUV-type vehicle. It's a 2008. The cost for that is just under $58,000. And then the second project is the replacement of Fire Engine 3, which you can see on the slide there. It's a 2008 model year. And that truck will then be recycled, if you will, into the reserve plan that the chief has. And the cost for that project is just over $785,000 for that engine. Moving on to the area of public works, there are two infrastructure-type projects. We have sidewalk construction for $350,000, and then roadway improvements for $400,000. And the projects that were explained at the capital planning meetings that we had were that the sidewalk construction area will likely include all Westford Road and the Fletcher Street areas, and the roadway improvements are planned for Manning Road, Biltmore Ave, Cliff Road, and Rack Road. Moving on, one more project for Public Works. This is replacing an older Sander model truck from 2005 at a cost of $165,000 to keep their fleet modernized and operating well. The next slide is for a project in municipal facilities. This is replacing an older 2006 pickup truck at a cost of $55,000. This is a project that was deferred in the past. Then we move into the area of school facilities. The first project, it's just over $156,000. This involves cleaning, repairing the ductwork at a number of schools, as well as replacing the hot water convector units at Westland School. That's something that's been deferred for a number of years. I want to say at least 3, and this is the school committee's and school administration's highest priority for this year. Moving on to the next slide, something that involves safety with stairways. You can see that there are stair tread upgrades and stairwell repairs planned. So basically what this involves is that the 3 schools there, Byam, Harrington, and Parker, they will have a rubber anti-slip surface installed over the concrete stairways, and also a number of the schools have concrete stairwells, and repairs will be done to the concrete surfaces where needed. Moving on to the next project, this involves Westlands, and from prior years, the schools have been systematically going through and upgrading a number of their restrooms. This will involve a complete restroom upgrade at this building for just over $455,000. And the next project involves the gymnasium walls at two schools, 2 elementary schools, actually, South Row and Center School. And the goal of this project is to repair the gym walls where needed, install some protective pads behind the basketball court, backboard area, just for safety. And the cost for that's just over $104,000. The next project involves a complete kitchen renovation at the Mccarthy Middle School. This is just over $438,000. And as I've mentioned, this is a continuation of, you've seen the school department systematically going through the school by location, trying to upgrade their kitchen and food preparation areas. And then moving on, the last project involves Chelmsford High School. This includes $325,000 to replace aging boilers at that location. And so that concludes all the different projects, and really the next step in the process will be these projects will be brought to town meeting in April, and assuming that schedule holds, we would then finance this through a borrowing, as we've done in the past, sometime around late June, early July. And the next slide is just the table that you normally see in the budget report and the Finance Committee book that just summarizes all of the different projects.
Thank you, John. So but behind all this is a 75-page line-by-line budgetary sheet that we review with department heads, and then the Finance Committee goes through and reviews individually, and then it gets published and sent to town meeting. None of this is landmark, I'll say. If you may recall, at Fall Town Meeting, we were required to, and John provided a 5-year financial forecast, which showed that we were basically balanced in that 5-year period without any expansion of programs and resources. And that's roughly what we foresee at this point in time going forward. It's almost as if you were continuing the end of the year and going into a new fiscal year, sort of just rolling over, and that's roughly what this is. Obviously, what changes is what we call fixed costs, i.e., we're a service organization that has labor, and we're at the bargaining table soon to be, because the agreements all expire at the current end of the year in 5 months, and then you've got these fixed costs, which are your health insurance, retirement assessment, debt service, and so forth, and that's sort of what propels us forward. And speaking to the superintendent earlier today, he'll be presenting tomorrow night at the school committee an overview budget that's relatively, again, level service in the school side with some minor modifications of needs that they have going forward. But in essence, we're coming, this is a bit of uncertainty. I think that's what makes me a little more nervous than a typical year. We're coming out of a pandemic, we hope, into maybe an endemic or what have you. And at the same time, you've got this unstable economic climate with inflation and tightening and some kind of a balance going forward, as well as the impact on the economy by the withdrawal of federal aid, which was provided to the stimulus. So I guess that's my polite way of saying I'm a bit nervous about what could happen between now and 17 months from now, in terms of, what shocks could impact the economy, between inflation as well as tightening, as well as the uncertainty. And I know we're always in a world of economic uncertainty, but I think right now we're sort of in a very unusual state that we've not seen, particularly with inflation, in basically generations. I mean, and so hopefully it's transitory and settles back down, but we will see. And that's always the danger of living under Proposition 2.5, is Proposition 2.5 is not based on inflation. It's 2.5%, whether it's 2% inflation or whether it's 5% inflation, and that's the governance. And why I mention and always harp upon the partnership with the state is the only way cities and towns have been able to survive under Proposition 2.5 is with the partnership from the state in terms of local aid partnerships. We have an uncertainty there. We don't know who the governor will be in November and what his or her commitment will be to local aid and communities. And the only other recourse on that is, overrides, and that's not happening in Chelmsford. The last time Chelmsford had a Proposition 2.5 override was 30 years ago, and that was to deal with trash collection. And so that's not happening either. So, we believe this is a measured budget. It's a conservative budget, and we think it'll get us there. But it's, I'm a little more unsettled than I've been in past years. Last year we had the unknown with the pandemic, as we were, right now you still have the unknown with the pandemic, and then you've got this issue of a contracted labor force and inflation, which is, going to take a while to sift out, and it's going to be, I think it's just going to be a bumpy ride to get there. So with that, I'll stop and answer any questions that you may have at this time. Again, how this goes from here is the budget has been presented to you. John and I will present to the Finance Committee next week. They'll hold budget hearings with the individual departments, and then the board that's seated, the Finance Committee make its recommendations in April, in March, for publication in April. The Select Board will make its recommendations in April for a town meeting that is still remains scheduled at the end of April. So I'm not looking for any votes or actions this evening, because that's traditionally done after the election, in April at that time.
Was there something in the detailed spreadsheets that you wanted to point out to answer Ken's question?
Which question was,
He asked a question at the beginning, and you said you'll see it in the.
oh, sure. Well, if you want, I think the summary sheet is probably the best thing. If you go to page 70, I think it's called 77, right? It's, if you go to page 76, some page is called 76. That sort of gives you.
Am I on the right one, Pam?
It's the one that shows budget summary, exactly. And you can see right there, there's the bottom right is a 700,000. You asked about the issue about, well, where's the funds that would come available in the future for bargaining contracts that aren't settled. That's the bottom line. You then sort of look at the right-hand side and see your percentage changes from the current budget to the proposed budget on expenditures. And you can clearly see that most of them are high numbers, but when you look at the aggregate, coming down to the balance, you're roughly 700,000 to the positive, in terms of where we would be. So, again, you look at your percentages.
69 at the bottom, it's the one before that, the page.
All right,
is
yeah,
numbered.
you're, so.
It's page number 76.
There's no
it
page
just-
numbers on
and
it,
our-
it's printed.
Ours is no page
No
numbers.
76
It's on
printed
the other side of 75.
on the other
Yeah,
side of
but
70.
it's off.
Mine says 69.
Yeah, so does mine. It's the page numbers, it goes 75,
That's why we're all fumbling over here.
and then 70, no page number, then 69.
Okay, well, it's the no page number one.
Oh, no, it's a no page number one then, because 69 is is an enterprise
75.
budget, so it'd be,
But no page number, okay.
okay, I'm sorry, mine had a page number when I printed it out, I'm sorry. So again, if you look at the expenditure categories, municipal administration up 200% from the current budget, I'm sorry, 200,000 from the current budget, 5.5%. Schools up 2.5 million, 3.85%. Nashoba up 100,000, 2.78%. Public safety up 528,000 or 3.6%. Public works up, 273 or 3.5%. Facilities up 125,000, 6%. Cemetery up 16,000, 4.35. Community services up 200,000 by 14.9. Library up 68,000 or 3%. Benefits insurance up 1.57 million or 5.82%. You can see your $1.4 million decline in debt service of 11%. Warrant articles, that number is a huge number decline, because if you go back to the prior year, that has the free cash voted under warrant articles, so you've got to pull that out, because that's not a, part of the operating budget. It's part of what we track to make sure our budget is balanced at the end of the year. And then your state assessments are up 258,000 or 7%. So when you make those adjustments, that's how you go from what really is a $145.5 million budget, if you pull out the free cash and the warrant articles, to what will eventually be 149.5, but is 148.8 at this time, because we don't include the prospective labor settlements.
That's the 703?
That's the 703, exactly. And if you go back a page to 75, you see all the things that become part of that number of the, 2 million into the stabilization fund, the money, those are all the monies we use the free cash for, which again, those are not operating budget, those are reflected in the budget that's voted for the year, but they're not part of Proposition 2.5, because your cash comes from your balance of your prior year ending. And that now, which is noted on the top of the page.
Thank you.
And then similarly, the enterprise funds, there's no change there. For the sewer, stormwater, PEG access and so forth, it's level staffing. It's just rolling over their labor obligations going forward, and then the fixed costs and so forth they have, which are those 3 sheets at the end that have the numbers out of sequence, because those are enterprise funds. They're on separate sheets of the budget, but that's how, because we keep it in one consolidated document.
Did you have something else,
No.
Ken?
Good.
Okay. Okay, that brings us to item 6, which is the use of the state budget.
Yeah, this was requested at a previous meeting about a discussion on the use of the earmark, the $200,000 for parks improvement in the state's budget. With Select Board Member Dixon not here this evening, it's not that timely. I would suggest that we postpone that until the full board is present, because I know, it's something I think we'd want all 5 members for, that discussion.
Everybody okay with that?
Fine.
Okay.
I think George has a special interest with Barney Parks.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's where it's going, but I want him to be part of it. So under my report, just a few items. One is I'm pleased to inform you formally, even though I've sent you this email, that we were awarded another cybersecurity from the Massachusetts Executive Office of Technology Services and Security. So basically, we'll be involved with another year-long employee end-user training, evaluation, and threat simulation for the town over the next year period. And we are, I just had a department head meeting with folks this morning. We are tracking our employees because, one, we have to report it to the state, but also we want to make sure that our employees are participating in the phishing exercises and training and all the modules. And if they are tripped up, that they go back and get additional training to make sure that we're doing our best to avoid ransomware, malware, and it's, as you know, it's a real threat out there. I know it's one of our goals and concerns for the year, and given the uncertain international crisis, that's destabilization, this is probably even more of a concern. So we are doing it, and when our IT director is available, he'll have an executive session to discuss with you in greater detail and answer any questions that the board may have. But
So I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
I don't think the executive session has questions.
Sure.
It mentions 300 employees. Would that include this board and other boards that have chelmsfordma.gov email addresses or not?
It's a good question, Pat. We've targeted general government employees. We've not involved board members in that training.
Is there 300 in that group?
Yeah, it roughly is.
There is, okay.
Yeah.
We've gotten the test phishing emails.
Yeah, you'll get
That
the
was
test
gonna be
phishing
my-
email,
That was
yeah.
going to be my next question.
Right.
So if we get something
You'll
like
get
that, should
that.
we report it?
No, I mean, if you get
It's a test.
It's a test.
Right,
Yeah,
but I
we-
know somewhere
yeah.
it says that the test is monitored to see if people
Yeah.
report it. So that's why I didn't know if we should, let Ted or somebody know
Yeah, you're part
that
of
we
it.
have gotten that.
Yeah, no, let us know if you do.
Because I
if you
usually
have
just
yeah.
ignore it, but.
Yeah, because they're using our database, Ted's using our database, which is everybody with an email address. It's a challenge with some of the board members. It's also a challenge with some employees who aren't working behind a computer in most capacities, such as public safety and public works, where, but But yeah, let Ted know if that's, when you receive those messages so that it doesn't dampen our participation rates, but that would be great.
Okay.
I think more importantly, if you do fall for it, they get a report telling them that you clicked on the link and.
Right.
I mean, they monitor that, I think, more importantly.
Okay, the next thing I have is, since our last meeting, and Pat knows this, as our rep to NIMCOG, the Northern Middlesex Council of Governments is again issued a request for proposals for local technical assistance grants. They don't give us a huge turnaround time on these things, as we note every year. And this year, the deadline is Wednesday, February 9th, which is before your next meeting. So I sent the information out to you in advance, and then what we're thinking of a project at this point in time, and this really comes out of the master plan, and I included Evan's memo in there. There's been a lot of discussion in the master plan update and some of the projects around town about these land use zoning area conflicts. And so we're thinking that this might be a good project to submit for NIMCOG's assistance in terms of, can we create a master list of these conflict areas and then provide a means of options to address these concerns in terms of the buffer zones between residential and commercial areas of the town. So that's where we are. If anybody else has any suggestions, let us know, because what ends up happening is usually they get undersubscribed, and then NIMCOG will send out a second RFP saying, there's still funding available, for, let us know your areas of interest.
A question.
Go ahead.
Included in here is this Permit Extension Act, which they seem to include every year.
Yeah.
Now, would anything still, at this point, be eligible for that? I mean, it's way past when that was implemented, and it was a 4-year extension, so.
In fact, there is one, and if you, in this room on Thursday night, the 40B project on Riverneck Road, affordable housing project, is still under that act, and
Oh, really?
and they're coming for another extension on Thursday night.
But that's not from the automatic one, correct?
Earlier phases, it was automatic.
Right.
And then they were before the Board of Appeals a couple years ago, and they said at that time would be their last extension request. Well, they're back again for another extension request.
Right.
So, yeah, you still have some that go back that far. Because a lot of it was because of the tolling with the pandemic and so forth, they kept pushing the dates
Okay,
out.
yeah, okay.
So, yes, you still have that. And then related to that is the opening of the One Stop for Growth expression of interest from the Commonwealth, which is sort of almost like a parallel. That's for the programs such as Mass Works and so forth, type of grant programs from the state. And speaking with Evan Belansky, the areas that we think we'd have interest would be, at this point in time, perhaps assisting with the development of 255 Princeton Street, much like we did on Groton Road. You remember we were able to get a MassWorks grant for the water main? And if you're familiar with that project on 255 Princeton Street, that's a significant cost to connect them to the North Water District. So that may be an area that we may issue an expression of interest. And then obviously the default areas remain the same, the updating the Center Village planning, the Vinyl Square planning, the 129 planning, and even Drum Hill corridors in terms of, planning assistance, in terms of what areas we would need to plan for in terms of growth or development. So those are the, if you have any suggestions, that one's it's an optional thing. Expression of interest are only optional, so there's no commitment there, but it does sort of give you the ability to get some feedback from state officials for when the Mass Works and other applications open in March and later in the spring. So again, if you have any thoughts in the weeks ahead, please let me know or let Evan know, and we'll explore those. The next item I have under my report was sort of a report that we didn't see coming, but and we don't think we've seen it before, and talking to John, is the Massachusetts Public Employee Retirement Administration Commission, known as PERAC for the acronym, folks. They issued an Opeb summary report as of December of 2021, and for every city and town and across the Commonwealth. And I wrote this memo because I think it just shows how well Chelmsford has fared compared to our neighboring and comparable communities. We're at a 25% funded ratio at that point in time, which I think just speaks well to the fact of where we are compared to, some of our neighbors, and it really just shows, as John noted, that we really caught a fortunate investment wind in the recent market up through the end of December. But it does help the town in the long term in terms of meeting this growing liability, which is now over $68 million. And, in our budget, we continue the prescribed level of funding, that's in our plan, so.
Paul, how do these other towns get such enormous balance requirements? Like, how does Drake get a $163 million liability?
And if you go into the report, it also, your liability is on your blended discount rate. And basically what happens is you have a different discount rate depending upon your funding level. And John, John?
Yeah, I was gonna say, so if you're funding it just a token amount, and I'm not saying that, I'd have to look more into Drake, and don't want to discuss specific towns like that, but you basically, if you're doing just a token amount or almost no amount of funding, you almost have to use like a cash rate of either, it's either 4% or less. I know the rules have changed a little, so if you have to use a very small discount rate, it just explodes your liability and makes it really, really skews it.
I mean, Natick's doesn't have anything in there, and they're at 195, where Drake gets at 163, Billerica's at 263. I mean, Billerica's funding at 2%, Natick's at 0, but Natick's a bigger town.
Yeah.
I mean, Natick's mirrors us very closely.
Yeah, but Billerica's a bigger town than us or Natick. I mean, Billerica's over 40,000 people. Natick is roughly our size.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think they're the best town that
43,000.
resembles us.
Yeah, right, but.
Square footage,
Right.
the size of the town, the amount of.
And I found it hard to believe that Natick hadn't put anything into Opeb. That struck me as odd, but just going on what Perrick's reported.
Some towns too have water and sewer combined, like I know Billerica, just because they're a neighbor, and there's others, so, and here, if we had additional employees that were under the town for water, they would be covered under this too, so there's sometimes little differences.
It's true. Yeah, if we were running sewer for decades, and also we don't have water utility under ours as well. So that helps us, that sort of distorts us to the point where our number would probably be around Tewksbury and so forth if we were running a water utility.
Although the Chelmsford Water District is 100% funded.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
so
But if we had it, we probably would be more similar to the other towns. Anyway, I just thought it was an interesting report and to be highlighted. And then the last thing I have under my report on the agenda is we did receive, since our last meeting, a risk management award for the calendar year 2021 from the Meyer Property and Casualty Group for our efforts of prevention, and you see the details in the reports that were put online at the MMA website, and again, that sort of keeps down our costs because your claims experience is better and so forth. So I just wanted to note that. And then sort of related to that, or just in general, the only other thing I will mention as I wrap up my report is, and it happened since the agenda was posted, was I just really want to express my appreciation for the public safety and public works crews during this last storm over the past weekend. It seems overwhelmingly positive feedback from, the snow and ice removal, as well as the public preparedness and response for police and fire and such during, what was, a major snowfall, and sort of the big one of the season.
we hope.
We hope. And, I just want to commend them that, they worked a grueling schedule, and they're going to be out tonight and tomorrow night in Vinyl Square and in the center, removing the snow, because right now you can't park in those areas, and that's something the town has historically done with high snowfalls, is to free up the parking in some of the spaces there. But I just want to commend, we had the library open, 1 o'clock yesterday on Sunday after the storm, and schools open today without delay. and sidewalks were cleared and so forth. I mean, I just really want to thank, them for what was a long haul, because, they work a day on Friday, they go home and rest for a few hours, and they're back out at midnight, and then, doing 14-plus hour shifts, and, and obviously being down private contractor crews, the burden fell upon our employees who were out there, and there were Water District employees who contributed as well, and
Well, from what I heard, too, Gary Persichetti was driving a plow truck, and Joe
Yeah.
Erickson was driving a plow truck.
Yeah, they were out in the farms, yeah.
incredible.
Gary was out in the farms and
So
doing
Sunday
it.
night, the schools, I went by Mccarthy, and Sunday night at, I don't know, it was 8 o'clock, and whoever it was shoveling the sidewalk and putting down salt, and I
Yeah.
was like, wow, these guys are killing themselves.
Yeah, so it was a really job well done, and, just, real pleased, and it was just good to see the recognition in the community as well on social media and so forth, that, it's often a thankless task being out there, and the only good thing, the good thing was the timing of that storm couldn't have been better for us, because, it starts before any commute and traffic, and then, you don't have to worry about getting to the schools and the school delays now, whereas this week, again, if the forecast comes and the rain turns to snow, and who knows what Friday will be like. So I just wanted to thank them for their efforts. And again, we're hopeful it'll be a quieter remainder of the winter, but at least we're through January at this point, and December, so hopefully we got February and maybe a little bit of March ahead of us, so we're heading in the right direction. So thank you, Madam Chair, and members of the board.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, that brings us to the minutes process. Mark, do you want to lead us in this one?
Sure. What this document was attempting to do was to document the process that we use on the select board only for public session minutes and then for executive session minutes. I could go down, do you want me to just kind of go down through it a little bit? So what this does is document the process between the recording secretary, our support services coordinator, which is Christina Bruce, and the chair and select board clerk, in how the minutes get drafted, how they get processed, and then how they eventually get voted on, and eventually then they get posted. So the minutes themselves are drafted from the telemedia recording. Those minutes are then distributed to all the select board members, for which they're given a certain amount of time to provide edits into the support services coordinator. Those edits will be put together, and then that new document or new draft will be brought forward publicly to the board for their review and discussion if there's any other changes that are needed. If that is not the case, then that is voted on, and that particular document then becomes final and is posted on the, posted by the clerk. So it's pretty similar to what we've been doing in the past, but again, this just kind of documents that process.
So I just have one question on that. On the
Sure.
The fourth paragraph, second sentence says, when possible, the time point of the proposed edit should be provided. What do you mean by the time
Oh,
point?
that was just so that if you do have an edit that you're proposing, if you could provide a time, in other words, at what time in the recording did you see that issue? So whether it comes one way or the other, it's helped me on many occasions when the recording secretary has provided that timestamp in the past. So if you do know the time when you're looking at the recording, if you
Yeah,
can
I usually
provide
don't.
that, it's helpful.
Okay.
That's all. Rather than, sometimes they're 3-hour, 3.5-hour meetings, so it can really help you to get to the point quickly. Okay? And on the executive session side, same thing, this documents what that process is, where the executive minutes are drafted by the clerk or designee. Those minutes are then, and those are drafted from notes, not from any telemedia, because there is no telemedia for executive sessions. Those minutes are then coordinated out with the select board for their review and comments like before. Those are then brought forward to another executive board meeting, and those are reviewed during that meeting with any suggested edits, amendments, and so forth. And once those changes have been incorporated, at that point, there is a motion, there's a vote, et cetera, and if those are approved, and then the board in this case will also look to determine whether they can be released or whether they need to be held. And in the event of when they're held, of course, those are held by the support services coordinator, but in some cases, they can also be held confidentially by the board themselves. And that's actually held in a secure location, in a secure box. The biggest change in this area is that when this particular vote on releasability is held, that vote will then be documented at the end of the original minutes, is what we're trying to get to, as opposed to generating another set of minutes for that particular activity. What it was causing is minutes for minutes, that type of thing. And actually, if somebody were to go back to review what happened in that meeting, and then to go back to find out about releasability and so forth, they'll all be contained in one document. It'll actually be easier historically to go back and look it up.
So where does it say that? Because that's where I was trying to, like, you have this this paragraph that says during the review of the draft minutes.
Yep. It's after approval. I think that, let me just come down here with you.
After approval,
Determinations of releasability will be communicated based on the select board's determination, hang on. No, it's the next one up, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
no, it's so like somewhere should there be a statement that says,
It says, once this has been determined by the select board, in other words, whether it's releasable or not, the motion and vote on releasability of executive session minutes will be noted at the end of the original minutes/segment with a statement that reflects the date of the vote, the motion, and the votes taken. This section of the recording documenting releasability will be confirmed by the chair and clerk for accuracy.
should that also include the motion and vote on the approval of the minutes or the minutes as amended, the whole, not just the releasability, right? Because we're in this do loop now where we have minutes to approve that we approved minutes and releasability.
I think that's right above it, is it?
Well, that's what I'm trying to
So
understand.
during the review of the draft minutes, so we're in executive session. we're
Right,
reviewing the
it says
draft
a
minutes.
motion to approve the minutes as well as roll call votes shall be taken and recorded.
Right.
But it's not the same way as what you said with the releasability. So it just wasn't clear to me that
Right,
that's
well-
what we were trying to do.
Well, if you looked at this, if you kind of drew a line under that paragraph there, that's how we normally do it today. What we're doing is adding this next paragraph there, which is about releasability. That's where what we used to do is generate another set of
No,
minutes.
but the approval of the minutes themselves is also generating another set of minutes. So that's, all I'm saying is what you're saying for releasability should include the approval of the minutes themselves. We make a motion to approve the minutes or to approve the minutes as amended, and we make a motion on the releasability of the minutes.
Okay, I thought that's what this one said right above it, so.
All it says is it's going to be recorded, but it doesn't say where or how in the same way that the next paragraph says where and how for
Okay, so
releasability.
what are you recommending? So after recorded, do you want something there?
Unless I'm off, I mean, you guys
No, I'm
speak
just,
up,
no,
but,
if you don't understand it, then
So
that's
in
not
other words,
good.
it's going to be a two-step process to approve them. One is to approve as amended, and then
Right.
another one is to whether to release.
so,
that correct?
what he's trying to accomplish, Pat, we can.
Yeah,
still-
I know what he's trying to
We
accomplish.
can still take the vote as approve and not release, or however we want to do it, but
Right.
what he's trying to accomplish is that when we do it, so let's say we meet on January 1st in an executive session, and we're reviewing and approving and voting whether to release or not release executive session minutes. What he's trying to accomplish is that right there, both the vote on the approval and the vote on releasability are recorded, done, end of story, so that when we meet on January 3rd, we're not approving the minutes to say that we reviewed and approved minutes. Like, we're in this endless do loop right now.
Right, I
No,
understand.
That's
we
just
understand.
where the wording wasn't clear to me, that we're doing it for the vote as well as the releasability.
But it would be in both, it would be in both locations, right? Whatever meeting you would make those votes, that would be in those meeting
Right,
minutes.
so the final minutes.
But then the minutes themselves would have that record as well.
At the end of the
Right, so they'd
minutes,
be-
once that's all completed, it'll then be
Right.
recorded there for the
But
date. and when-
all it says is a motion to approve the minutes as well as roll call votes shall be taken and recorded. I could say we do that today. So all I'm saying is that should be explicit, that it's going to be taken and
As the-
recorded as the
say,
final.
final minutes. Okay,
Yeah,
I could just
or
say that.
something like
That's
that.
fine. No, that's fine.
And then I have a question in this paragraph here that starts after approval. The last line here, Mark.
Okay.
I think it leaves out
I
clerk.
think it should say select board clerk or the chair. It just says select board or the chair.
Oh, okay, yep.
Is that correct? Is that what you meant to say?
It could go either way. It could say select board chair or clerk, or it could go the other way.
No,
So-
I think you're just missing a word.
Yep, no,
It just says the whole select board.
I have it.
Okay. Okay, you want to go to the next session?
Is there, okay, so then, were you good down to the audit section? Anybody have any other questions there? Okay. So then auditor held minutes. The select board chair or appropriate designee shall from time to time, but no circumstances less than 6 months, review held minutes to determine whether continued non-disclosure of minutes is warranted. Also, that should, also be looking for any kind of confidentiality type of issues that may warrant them remaining confidential.
Is that a function of the chair, or is that the clerk or the chair?
I
What
think
is it
I think the
typically?
state law says the chair or a designee.
Yeah,
Oh,
that's
okay.
exactly,
Okay, thank you.
what's here is exactly what it says.
Oh, thank you. Okay.
And just, by the way, this was vetted by town council, so I think it's,
Okay.
from those particulars, it's probably accurate. And then, again, to go through, if once minutes have been determined that they may be releasable, then at that point, it does need to come back into the select board for a vote at that time, and for that particular issue to be released from there. There's another piece in here that also says that if an issue were to become non-confidential or releasable, let's just say, in a period much sooner than 6 months, it shouldn't be held till 6 months to be released. It should be brought forward sooner in order to be reviewed and to be released at that point. So if there are any things like that, they should be brought up. And then the last piece is, in some fashion, that these reviews do need to be documented so that it shows when and who actually did the reviews and what the status of that review was for each individual minutes.
So I just had a couple of questions on this one, too. It's a nit, but I think in the top of the third page, town council should be capitalized.
So where am I?
The top of page 3, where it says town council.
Okay.
On that first line, I think that should be capitalized. And if the chair, so this talks about what to do if the chair thinks something is releasable, but if the chair reviews something and deems it to not be releasable, my understanding is we still have to announce that at a meeting and say these minutes were reviewed and deemed still not releasable.
That's for every time you review them?
That's how it was explained to me before.
Well, if you do
Could
take
we-
a look here,
could-
there is still a PH to review.
Right, well, that was my
So
other
that
question.
is still kind of
Could we
a pending.
Could we ask that question, because that was how we were advised before by
I will
a
ask
different
him that.
attorney.
Yep, I'll ask him that. But that is the one piece that is kind of hanging out there. I know he hasn't had a chance to, to get back on that, because one of the questions I also had was, well, actually, it's not in this document, so I don't want to confuse this, so.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Paul?
Just a suggestion, if the policy is that it be done every 6 months, should you put in there like a definitive period? In other words, the board resets in every April. So should you like say by July 1st and January 1st, the board, should review them in, in other words, what's your benchmarks? Who's tracking the 6 months?
You could, except, so I think it gets tracked where it's documented that the review was done.
Right, exactly.
Because there's nothing to say, suppose I did the review in February, right? Maybe something comes up and I go and I review again in April, and now the 6-month clock is
It moves
reset again.
Okay. So rather than having fixed periods, you just have it rolling and then.
I think so, and
relying on the
Christina's
6 months.
or whoever the support services coordinator is documenting the date it was done, so whoever the rolling chair is knows when the last review was, if that makes sense.
And they'll be told that it's coming up.
Yeah, I was
Well,
gonna
yeah,
say, do we know when the last one was? I don't know right now. What?
The last one was more than 6 months ago,
Right.
because I think Pat did it a long time, when Ken was chair.
I thought it was after that point, when everything except for the one issue was released. But I don't know. I mean,
That's
I
been
could-
I don't know, I had made a mental note that we needed to do it in January, and
Okay.
bad on me, I haven't done it, so I'll do it.
Okay.
Well, one of the things I also asked Paul was, is there a format that would make the most sense, just to make it as straightforward as possible?
I think Christina has some kind of tracking format she's set up.
Yeah, the only question about that is that's just an Excel spreadsheet, so
Oh, okay.
that's capturing status, it's not necessarily capturing a signature of that it was done. So that's another question I have to Paul,
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yep,
because, anybody could make that kind
Put a
of
date in, yeah.
annotation. And the fact that the annotation's there is great, it's a good tracking mechanism, but it should be backed up by a signed document. This was my question out to Paul.
so you want to take another pass at this with council and?
Yeah, I'm
bring
still,
it back?
like I said, this
Okay,
is
great.
where it is right now. And then there's a broader one that is also with him now to be looked at, so,
Anybody else have anything?
okay.
Thank you, Mark.
Yep.
And thank you, Paul and John, for all the budget work. That brings us to liaison reports. Pat?
The only thing I have, I think everybody received the email from Paul that was forwarded from Denise Pigeon at Nashoba, that they are going to have their budget breakfast, if they can, on February 11th, which is a Friday at 10 o'clock. I guess, according to the email, the plan is to have it in person if possible, but otherwise it will be virtual, so that's usually an interesting presentation by her, and if they have breakfast, it's a good breakfast, too.
And little tchotchke giveaways. Mark, do you have anything?
No, I don't.
Ken?
I'm all set.
I just have one. As Paul mentioned, the school committee wanted me to remind the public that on February 1st, Jay Lang will be presenting his preliminary budget recommendations for fiscal '23, and the public will have the opportunity for input at a public hearing on March 1st. And also just a reminder that at the February 1st meeting tomorrow, Doran Whittier will be returning to hopefully finalize what their approach will be for a new building project proposal to submit to the Massachusetts School Building Authority later this spring. And I don't see any press anywhere, so with that, it is 7:38 PM. I will.
I will make a motion to adjourn.
I'll second the motion.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Only vote of the night, and it's 4-0.